Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are going to be looking at the role of data in building economic resilience for the COVID-19 recovery. My name is Elisa Sklar. I'm your moderator for today, and I am the VP of Marketing for GIS Planning. And so with that, I would like to introduce our presenter for today. That's Gary Menger. He is the president of Applied Geographic Solutions. Gary is the founder and president, in fact, of AGS. They were founded in 1996 with a focus on building small area databases and geographic data applications. The initial modest offering of estimates and 5-year projections gradually grew into over 30,000 attributes covering a broad spectrum of data. AGS has been supplying data to GIS planning for nearly 2 decades. And I wanted to add to that we are very proud users of AGS data in our GIS planning tools, Zoom Prospector, intelligence components. I believe we're using some of it in our new Zoom business tool as well. And we are really delighted to be able to feature Gary in AGS today, because I think it's really important that people understand the value of what they're getting. So welcome, Gary. Thank you very much for doing that with us today.
Well, thank you, Elisa. It's great to be here today and to be able to talk to people about some of the things that we're doing, and especially as they relate to kind of economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and the response that we've seen. I do want to give you a brief introduction. Elisa already covered some of this stuff, but we basically took the approach years ago of saying that we wanted to be a data company and not a software company. During the 1980s, when I first got involved in this business, what we saw happen was that the data companies gradually morphed into software companies and forgot their roots and forgot that they were primarily there to create good data. And so we've adopted a couple of strategies to make sure that we do that. One is that we have adopted a channel partner model, so that we aren't tempted to be out there talking to end users and so forth, unless we're asked along by one of those channel partners. And we very much decided that we would keep our organization small and very focused. So we have a total of 6 people, and 3 of us are dedicated towards the data. It's all we do. Between the 3 of us, we have about 90 years of experience, maybe a little bit longer. I tend to lie on the short side these days. And as Elisa said, GIS planning has been one of our key partners now for almost 20 years. I think from the time that GIS planning was founded, we have been working together, and it's always been a delight to work with GIS planning. They're a great organization, and they've got some great products. So on that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the range of those 30,000 variables. It's hard to believe that we got up that high, but we have content covering the normal demographics from 1970 census moving forward, including current year and 5-year projections. But over the years, we've also added a complete business database. Some people call it a workplace database, where we're looking at where the firms are and how many people they employ, and looking at some of the patterns on the landscape of land use and things like that. We also have a pretty extensive set of consumer expenditure data that we have been working with for a good 20 years. And we roll that into retail merchandise lines and then into estimated merchandise potential, retail potential. And finally, we kind of pair that up with the business data in what we call a retail gap database. And I'll show you a map later on. We also have a number of very interesting things, one of them being our crime risk data, which gives you a relative assessment of the riskiness of neighborhoods in relation to each other. And I'll move on from there, and we'll talk about the core topic here today, which is the unemployment data. And basically, we started this exercise in mid-March One Friday afternoon, we were discussing our upcoming release, and we release data twice a year. And so our release was scheduled for the end of April. And technically, we say that our data is for January 1 of the target year. And I was looking at it going, okay, the unemployment numbers that have just come out are shocking. And I think over time, the shock value is kind of diminished, but we have well in excess of 35 million people who have filed for unemployment insurance in just 13 weeks. The peak week was almost 7 million. And we are, again, it's shocking to say it, but we're way, way down to 1.6 million, which is a good number. A year ago, people would have been horrified at that. But we've been basically providing these data at a very detailed level using a set of models that we put together that look at the mix of occupations and the mix of industries within each area. We've made a whole bunch of adjustments to them as kind of time has unfolded in front of us. And I'm pretty pleased with what we've done. And one of the things that we did is we said, we want to make this available to anybody who wants to use it. So this data is freely available as long as you don't then turn around and sell it to somebody. So on that, I thought I'd look at some specifics within Los Angeles. I chose LA because it's been my home for almost 30 years now, and I know it well enough that I can talk about it. I want to start with some key areas that we'll be looking at, and on this base map, you'll see if you look on the west side from Beverly Hills to Santa Monica, and then up and down the coast tend to be the upscale areas, and South Central LA. So if you look on the map and you see Los Angeles, East Los Angeles in the middle, and to the south of there, down pretty much to Long Beach is a very challenged area that I think most of us are familiar with. It includes South Central LA, parts of East LA, and certainly the Watts area. The third area is what they call the Inland Empire. It took me years to figure out what they meant by that. And it means the eastern San Gabriel Valley. You'll see San Bernardino, Redlands, Ontario, and Riverside. And then finally, the coastal Orange County from Huntington Beach to San Clemente is also an area that we're going to talk about. So if you look, this is a base map of unemployment as of January 2020. These are our estimates just prior to when things broke out. And we were running at roughly 3.5% unemployment nationwide. Los Angeles area about the same. But you'll see even on here that there's a big red area just south of downtown Los Angeles where unemployment rates were already in the 14% range. And then you'll see higher unemployment rates in general in that area called the Inland Empire. And a few places in the San Fernando Valley to the north, you'll see those high ones. On the west side along the coast, you will see typically low unemployment numbers. Again, those are the affluent parts of town. So what we did is, rather than try and do a week by week, I simply took the 12-week period from March 7th onwards. And what we see here is that the areas in red early on are still red. They are typically now running at 30 to 35% unemployment. These maps were done before the last revision of the unemployment data, and so we have re-estimated them downwards. And in some of these areas, when I looked this morning, they're still running at 25 to 30%. What you'll see here is that the areas which were already suffering have suffered the most, and I think that's become fairly well known. Unemployment rates in South Central LA have gone from 10% to easily 30 to 35%, and it's very concentrated. If you go up and down that coast through places like Pacific Palisades and Malibu and down towards Santa Monica, you will not find those kinds of unemployment rates. They're definitely higher. There's lots of people unemployed, but the effects of unemployment have been very strongly felt in particular communities within LA. So we started to look at some of the factors. What we discovered was that nationwide, I think this is the case, that the more diversity that an area has in terms of occupations, so you've got a mix of people in hospitality and retail, executives, and so forth, that the more diverse the occupational mix, the better these areas have fared. And again, you'll see that we have some very low diversity areas south of Los Angeles that are also the hardest hit. They tend to be service workers. They tend to travel fairly long distances to get to work. And by and large, they're all out of work at this point in time. And it's not really clear yet whether or not those will come back. So in a way, what this is a measure of vulnerability. For those who are interested, diversity measures originally came out of biology, where people would look at the mix of species in an area. And effectively what this measure is if I am a raccoon and I'm walking through the forest, I meet another creature. What is the probability it's also a raccoon and not something else? So that the higher the score here, the more diverse it is. So in this context, if I work in retail, what is the probability that that first person I see on the street also works in retail? We also did this for industries. So here we're looking at, rather than the particular occupations, but the sectors. So we've got manufacturing, and we've got mining and oil exploration and healthcare and so forth. And we see a similar thing going on, that the more diverse the area in terms of its industrial mix, the less the impact of the COVID-19 shutdown was. In this case, what we tend to find is that the diversity in the northern areas, so north of downtown, up into the San Fernando Valley, tends to be higher. There's a greater mix of industries represented. And again, if you look down at just south of the Los Angeles tag on the map, you will see that it is very low in terms of industrial diversity. And those areas typically are the ones that have suffered the most. And you'll see the same thing out in Riverside, San Bernardino, Rancho Cucamonga, and so forth. In that case, a lot of those employees are commuting all the way into downtown LA, or some of the warehouses and so forth just east of LA. And so you've got people who have basically moved to the outer suburbs to take jobs which are not necessarily very well high paying. They have long commute times, and their local neighborhoods have truly suffered because of the massive uptick in unemployment in those areas. So we started to say, well, when this is over, what are the kinds of things that will help an area to rebound quickly? And one of the things that we thought about was what percentage of the people are self-employed, with the assumption being that somehow the people who are self-employed might be more likely to start new businesses. They might be more entrepreneurial minded. And Los Angeles is very unique in that we have fairly large areas of the city that have very high percentages of self-employment, over 40% in some areas. So if you look the northwest part of that map, Pacific Palisades, Malibu, Brentwood, there's a high degree of self-employment. And it was just a kind of idea that we had that perhaps if you looked at that, you might see some initial hints as to where that rebound ends up coming from. one of the other areas that we looked at is something using our retail gap data. This particular map is of the gap between retail demand for grocery stores and supply. So this is kind of the culmination of putting together our daytime or workplace data with the consumer expenditure data. And when we start to really analyze it, what we see is the areas in dark red are very much underserviced by the grocery stores. So South Central Los Angeles, you'll see the same thing in Fullerton and Anaheim, out in the Inland Empire, San Bernardino, and so forth. These generally correspond to areas which are economically vulnerable because of the occupational mix, have fairly low incomes, they have long commute times. The one area that doesn't really fit is you'll see that band of dark red along the coast from Santa Monica down to Palos Verdes. And that is simply because of consumer preferences. The people who live in those neighborhoods don't shop at big grocery stores, and the grocery stores figured that out long ago and closed them. But this I just thought was a very interesting use of some of these more obscure data sets, some that I actually generally have viewed as being primarily oriented towards the real estate or retail sectors, and not necessarily to economic development agencies. But I do think that in this particular case, it really demonstrates that some of the data that we can put together can really show areas of vulnerability, and hopefully areas that can then be worked on to improve the overall health of communities. So we kind of put together a little bit of a quick risk of some of the factors that we think influence the vulnerability of communities. The mix of occupations and industries, I think, is probably one of the biggest ones. Age, sex, and race, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, that areas with a lot of older people certainly suffered more. Economic equality kind of rolls out of those first two. And then we have two other areas. One is crime risk. And again, if you look at Los Angeles from a relative crime standpoint, those very areas which are economically vulnerable, have low income, and have suffered the most also tend to have the higher crime rates. And then finally, we do have a set of about 9,000 demand variables that get very specific in terms of medical conditions that try and get at what is the demand for various medical services. And we've used it a few times in recent weeks to put together some maps showing areas that are particularly vulnerable in the pandemic, where it's a little bit more than age, sex, and race. It's the degree to which a population is healthy. And there are areas of the country where you may have a younger demographic, but you actually have very high risk because of other conditions that tend to be prevalent there, like diabetes and obesity and so forth. Finally, because I think it's always important to try and look at the bright side of things, this is a very short and incomplete list, but we can look at what factors might influence the resiliency of a community or neighborhoods within a town. And I think certainly entrepreneurial outlook is one. How likely are people to be willing to go out and risk things on starting new businesses? There are variables above and beyond just educational levels. We actually have a number of measures which get at the relative level of optimism of the population. And there are some surprising differences between areas in terms of what percentage of people look at the world really through an optimistic lens instead of a pessimistic lens. And there are neighborhoods where the vast majority of people have that pessimistic lens on. And I'm not sure how you remove it other than over the long haul with increasing opportunity for people, presumably comes some optimism. The second thing is the incubators that might be there. Local colleges and universities, I think, are always a great source of innovation, as well as the kinds of firms that tag along, if you will, with some of the large tech and research firms. I'll give you an example of the town where I live, which is Thousand Oaks to the northwest in Ventura County. There was a couple of 4 guys in the 1980s who started a biotech lab. Unfortunately, it was in their garage, which is kind of dangerous, but that's where it was. And they started this company, and over the course of the last 30 years, the growth of Amgen up in Thousand Oaks has created an environment of tag-along firms, if you will, that have brought their own types of innovation. So you get software companies associated with medical research and with medical, what's the word, testing, clinical trial stuff. We've had every major biotech firm open up an office in Thousand Oaks in the 1990s. And that leads to a different sort of workforce that is there to support, in Amgen's case, everything from the manufacturing to the research. And it's been one of those incubators which has really done a lot for the city. And it's done a lot for the small university that we have as well, that has, I think, benefited from it. And it's a symbiotic relationship then between the university and the and that innovative firm. And the third thing is looking at encouraging industrial diversity. I think that in the world of economic development agencies and municipalities, that one of the things that can be done over the long run to try and help neighborhoods and parts of a city become more resilient and more prosperous, I suppose, in the long run, is to try and find ways to diversify the local economy. And I think all too often we have this tendency to be looking to attract a big fish, when in fact it might be advisable to really be looking at trying to find those small business incubators that can over time perhaps develop into a specialization, and perhaps in time lead to other incubators deciding that they want to be there. So on that, I will turn it over to questions that might have arisen, and hopefully entertain those now if there are any.
Thank you very much, Gary. Lots of interesting things to talk about, and I think is particularly timely now. A lot of the questions that people are asking is about data and projections that we've long been using and how we adapt that to this kind of unexpected context. So I was really interested to see what you're talking about in terms of tracking things like occupational diversity, industrial diversity, the job projections, and information like that. I think that's very important. Just a reminder to everyone that you can ask questions, of course, by putting them in the questions field in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And also a reminder that we are recording today's session, and you will be getting a follow-up email with recording, with the links to the recording. So we do have one question. Trudy wants to know if the data you're talking about is available for Canada. Do you guys have any specific data for Canada?
No, we actually have not done data for Canada. I actually originally am from Toronto, and my early days of demographic forecasting were all in Canada. There are a couple of companies in Canada that I'm more than happy to put you in touch with. Actually, most of them I've known for good 35 years now.
And we work with some of them actually. So for our Canadians, we are using Environics, which, as I'm sure you know, Gary, uses StatsCan data and projections. We have MZ data that we can integrate into our tools. So MZ using specific workforce data and labor force data for Canadians. So that's something else that we use. And we have Info Group Canada for business and industry data in Canada. So, and of course, we're always happy to integrate local data as well. I think, nevertheless, the things that you're talking about here, Gary, in terms of resilience and using the data that you have to tell this story about recovery, but also to encourage businesses and regions, economic developers to think about resilience and how we might, nobody saw this coming, of course, but we want to be able to make sure that our regions are prepared and poised for recovery in different ways. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I just wanted to throw that out.
No, that's fine. The diversity measures we actually only came up with over the last little while. I've been aware of those kinds of measures in biology for years, but never really saw any particularly good reason to implement them. The other thing that we did is with income distributions, well-known coefficient called a Gini coefficient, which measures the relative income inequality of an area. And I've been working with this data for 40 years now, and just only recently said, well, why don't I put in this formula and see what it looks like? And this has really caused me to take a good hard look at our data and say, what else can we do with this? And I suppose in a way, how can we make our data more socially relevant? And I'm hoping that we're taking some steps towards doing that.
Excellent. Okay. Yes. Thank you. That's important things to think about, and important questions for people to ask, I think, as they're assessing data sources, to be able to understand what are like some of the important things that we need to look at. Do you have any other tips that you would give people as they're looking at a data source, questions that you want to ask about whether this is relevant for them?
It's a good question. I think that one of the things that a lot of people do when they look at a data set is they look at the individual elements for what they are on their own, and often don't really start to try and get imaginative with them. I think to be a good data analyst really means that you've got to be willing to almost treat yourself like you're an artist and look at relationships between data sets to see what comes out of it. And certainly that retail gap example was something that I can remember reading in the LA Times probably 10, 15 years ago about what they were calling the food desert. And so when we started mapping this data, we went, oh yeah, there's the food desert. It's right there, right in front of our eyes. But because we'd never really looked at it from a sociological perspective, honestly, most of the time we would be expecting the client to be a grocery store who already fully know that they're not there, but they themselves aren't necessarily concerned about the social implications of it. And I just think that when you take a step back and be willing to do a little bit of mathematics, whether it's in a GIS system or an Excel spreadsheet for that matter, you can discover a lot of things just by looking at the data in kind of a fresh perspective. And we've been doing a lot of that, and actually I've probably had more fun with data in the last 3 months than I've had in years, just because we're looking at things much differently. The whole unemployment thing, we started to do the mapping of COVID-19 cases and so forth, and it's interesting, but I think it was missing out on the impact of the lockdowns, especially. And I'm hopeful that that people will retain the optimism that we need in order to basically rebound from this in a short period of time. And I think, you know, some of this data really can help you get that optimism when you start to look at things, and it's really not as bad as it all seemed.
Right. Interesting. Okay, thank you. This takes us to the end of our half hour here. Is there any last things that you'd like to share with our participants before we say goodbye?
No, I just thank you for your attention, and you're interested in data and in geography especially. I hope that all of you are basically map hounds like I am, and on that, I will just thank you again for the relationship that we have with GIS planning and GIS planning clients, and hope to hear from you soon. If you have questions, you're welcome to send them to me at any time, and I'll be delighted to answer them, or try and answer them, or point you in the right direction.
That sounds great. Thank you. And as you can see, the contact information for Gary is on the screen right now. You will have that in the follow-up email as well. You can reach out to us at GIS Planning at any time to talk about how AGS data is integrated in Zoom Prospector, intelligence components, and other tools, either at marketing@gisplanning.com or sales@gisplanning.com, or of course, support@gisplanning.com. Gary, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our many participants. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy days to join us. Please stay safe, be well, and we look forward to connecting off the webinar as well. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.